Hello, and thank you for joining us on another Ceasefire Moment.
Today, we're just going to take a dive right into the biblical text regarding the seventh day rest or the Sabbath. And we're just going to go straight from scripture to scripture and see what the Bible has to tell us. We're going to start right here in Genesis 2 and 3, where it says, "And heaven and earth and all their array were finished. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, because on his rest from all his work, or creating, that there was to do." I'm using the Lexham English Bible. It's not a Bible I tend to use, but it was on the Logo software, which I have up here. You can dive into these on your own and do more further research. We're just going to look at how many times the Sabbath day is in the Bible and what does it say about it. The next place we find this is in Exodus 16:23. And when it is the sixth day, it's important to know who they is. We can find out who they is if we look back here at Exodus 12:37, where it talks about the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and that it gives a 600,000 number, and it said, "And others came with them." And you will notice if you dive into the Exodus that God pretty much says that anyone who wants to follow him can follow him. It doesn't have to be an Israelite, but every time it's referred to as the Israelites or the Israelite community, it is typically including those people unless God specifies otherwise. There are times when he does specify not the foreigner, or the foreigner can't do this, or the sojourner among you cannot do this. Otherwise, they're included in everything that's given to the Israelites at the time of the Exodus. So this they, if you read up further, this they includes them. And this is talking about the manna that he's going to give. And he said, "This is what Yahweh has said." Yahweh is the name of God. "Tomorrow is a rest period." So from this, we're like, well, what's tomorrow? Well, it said, "And when it was the sixth day." So that means that tomorrow is the seventh day. Tomorrow is a rest period, a holy Sabbath for Yahweh. So he says this over and over, that this holy Sabbath is for Yahweh. And he goes on to tell them what they can or shouldn't do. And this is where they're going to get the manna, and they can bake it or boil it or whatever they want. And they're supposed to keep it until the seventh day. "And Moses said, 'Eat it today, because today is a Sabbath for Yahweh. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you will gather it. But on the seventh day, the Sabbath, it will not be presented on it.' And on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, and they did not find any. And Yahweh said to Moses, 'How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?'" Now, I want you to notice something here. They haven't made it to Mount Sinai yet. This is still in the desert, the wilderness. They're still wandering. They haven't even made it to Mount Sinai. So somewhere along the line, they've gotten commandments. Because he says, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, because Yahweh has given to you the Sabbath. Therefore, he has given to you on the seventh day bread for 2 days. Stay each in his location. Let no one go from his place on the seventh day." And the people rested on the seventh day. "And the house of Israel called its name manna. And it was like coriander seed, white, and its taste was like a wafer with honey. And Moses said, 'This is the word that Yahweh has commanded.'" And then he goes on to tell some more. So it started with God resting in Genesis, and now we're in Exodus 16, and he's telling his people that you too will rest on the seventh day. In Exodus 20. Now, Exodus 20 is where we start to get the 10 Commandments, as they're known as. But what we need to notice, there's something unique about this, because everybody says, well, it's the fourth commandment. But God uses the Sabbath day a lot throughout Scripture outside of the fourth commandment. In fact, if you do a research, you'll find that the Sabbath day shows up over 100 and some times, but like adultery and murder and honor your father and mother show up in the teens. So Sabbath is very important. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, from the house of slaves. There shall be for you no gods before you, and you shall make no idol. You shall not misuse the name. And then remember the day of the Sabbath to consecrate it. 6 days you will work, and you will do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath for Yahweh, your God. You will not do any work. Now, when you start to wonder, well, who's he talking to? Remember, we saw where the Israelites included anyone who came with the Israelites. But here he goes into more detail, and he says, you or your son or your daughter, your male slave or your female slave, your animal, your alien who is in your gates. An alien. So anyone who's there with you in your gates, anyone who wants to be a part of the Israelite community, is to observe the Sabbath. And then he goes on to give all of these other commands that many are familiar with. And he said, down here it says, do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that his fear will be before you so that you do not sin. So these things are basically tests. And whenever you get deep down into it, you find out that they weren't never called commands. They weren't called the 10 Commandments. They were sometimes referred to as the 10 words, but most of the time the word kind of means either testimony or witness. So it was either could be called God's testimony, God's 10-word testimony, or God's witness, which can kind of make you think a little more about these so-called 10 commandments when you start thinking of them as a testimony. Here we are in Exodus 23. This is not in relation to being listed among the 10 commandments. This is portioned out about your work and your festivals that you're to keep. 6 days you will do your work, but on the seventh day you will stop, so that your ox and your donkey will rest, and the son of your slave woman and the alien will be refreshed. So you're not just stop working for yourself. You're stopping and observing the Sabbath so that your animals can rest and the other people around you can rest. Then he goes on to talk about 3 times in a year you will hold a festival to me, and he lists 3 festivals. Now, when we're looking, sometimes we'll see the word Sabbath, and sometimes we'll see the word Sabbaths. Sabbaths include the weekly Sabbath, which is on the 7th day, and it also includes appointed times, or God's Moedim, where he lists festivals that you're supposed to keep to him. You could call them God's holidays. Instead of having man-made holidays, we have God-made holidays. So this is all in one. It's talking about the festivals and what ones you'll keep. Here we are now in Exodus 31. And Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, and you speak to the Israelites, saying, surely you must keep my Sabbaths, because, he's going to tell us why, it's a sign between me and you throughout your generations. Throughout your generations meant like basically forever. As long as there's a generation that comes after you, that's forever. In order to know that I am Yahweh who consecrate you. So you keep the Sabbaths, see it's an S, that's including the feasts. You keep them as a sign to show that God has consecrated you. And you must keep the Sabbath, that's the 7th day, because it is holy for you. Defilers of it will surely be put to death, because anyone who does work on it, that person will be cut off from among the people. On 6 days work can be done, and on the 7th is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy day for Yahweh. Anyone doing work on the Sabbath day will surely be put to death. The Israelites will pay attention to the Sabbath. Again, don't get hung up on the word Israelites, because if you want to do your research, you'll find Israelites includes anyone within the Israel camp. There were Egyptians that came with them. There were other people who were slaves that came with them. Anyone doing work on the Sabbath will surely be put to death. The Israelites will pay attention to the Sabbath in order to fulfill the Sabbath throughout their generations as a lasting covenant. So we have the fact that all the Sabbaths together are showing that God has consecrated us, and the seventh day Sabbath is to show that they're in a covenant with Yahweh. It is a sign between me and the Israelites forever, because in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh he ceased and recovered. So even God observed rest on the seventh day. And when he finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, the stone tablets written with his finger of God. Now, the thing to notice here is he said all of this before he gave them the tablets of stone that has the 4th one on it that talks about the Sabbath day. So before he even handed them the stones, he's like, listen, you're going to keep my Sabbaths, which is the 7th day, and my feasts, and you're going to keep this 7th day rest to show that we are in covenant together and that I am your God. Exodus 34:21. 6 days you will work, and on the 7th day you will rest. In the time of plowing and in the time of harvest you will rest. So it doesn't matter if you've got stuff to do. And you yourself will observe the Feast of Weeks, the first fruits, and he goes on to talk about those. No one will covet your land when you go up to appear before Yahweh your God 3 times in the year. So he's saying that if you observe these 3 feasts and you come up to Jerusalem to honor me, then no one's going to covet your land. He's going to protect your land. But he's being pretty specific that even if you have to plow, even if you have to harvest, just rest on that day. Down here in Exodus 35, and Moses assembled all the community of the Israelites, and he said to them, these are the words that Yahweh has commanded for us to do. On 6 days work can be done, and on the 7th there will be for you a holy day, a Sabbath, a complete rest for Yahweh. Anyone doing work on it will be put to death. You will not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings on the day of the Sabbath. Let's go down to Exodus 35. On 6, he's assembled the community of the Israelites. On 6 days work can be done, and on the 7th there will be for you a holy day, a Sabbath of complete rest for Yahweh. Oops, sorry. That was the one we just read. I was like, that sounds familiar. Let's skip down to Leviticus 19. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the community of the Israelites, and say to them, you must be holy, because I, Yahweh, your God, am holy. Each of you must revere your mother and your father, and you must keep my Sabbaths. I am Yahweh your God. You must not turn to idols, and you must not make for yourselves gods of cast metal. I am Yahweh your God. And then he's going to also go into each of the love your neighbor yourself thing, which is, people think is a New Testament, but it's actually in the Old Testament as well. Okay, Leviticus 19. You shall keep my Sabbaths, and you shall revere my sanctuary. I am Yahweh. Again, Sabbaths, that's the 7th day rest, as well as the other feasts or holidays that he gave us. All right, Leviticus 23. For 6 days work is to be done, and on the 7th day shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy assembly. You shall not do any work. It shall be a Sabbath for Yahweh in all your dwellings. Now this is completely outside of the 10 Commandments at this point. And here he's specifically talking about his feasts and the ones that you should keep. They're holy assemblies, and they're his appointed time, or Moedim. And here's where he's going to list the 7th day, the Passover, Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Booths. Each one of them gives a a foreshadowing of something that Jesus is going to do when he comes the first time. And then it also gives a foreshadowing of something that he's going to do when it comes the second time. So, in summary, these are Yahweh's festivals which you must proclaim. And then it talks about going up to the temple and offering things, the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and that type of things. But it also says you're going to do these things, these burnt offerings and such, besides Yahweh's Sabbaths, and besides your gifts, and beside your vows, and beside all your free will offerings that you give to Yahweh. So here he's counting the seventh day rest and all of the festivals that he's given us to keep as part of our offerings to him. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you come into the land that I'm about to give you," this would be the promised land, "the land shall observe a Sabbath for Yahweh." So it isn't just about people observing a rest period. He wants the land to observe a rest period as well. "In the 7th year it shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land, a Sabbath for Yahweh." So even the land is to get a Sabbath rest year, and that is to be given to Yahweh. Here we are in Leviticus 26. "You shall not make for yourselves idols and divine images. You shall not raise up stone pillars for yourselves. You shall not put a sculpture stone in your land. Keep my Sabbaths. You shall revere my sanctuary. If you walk in my statutes and you keep my commands and you do them, then I will give you rains on your land." So this is before they're going into the promised land. But you'll notice this is not a list of 10 commandments. This is outside of the 10, and he's telling them to keep this. Leviticus 26. "The land shall enjoy its Sabbath." We just talked about that, where the land is supposed to enjoy a Sabbath year. That's every 7 years. "When the Israelites were in the desert, they found a man who was gathering wood on the day of the Sabbath. The one who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses, Aaron, and to all the community, and they put him under watch because it was not made clear what should be done with him. And Yahweh said to Moses, 'Surely this man must be put to death by stoning him. All the community must stone him with stones from outside the camp.' So the entire community brought him out to a place outside the camp, and they stoned him to death, just as Yahweh had commanded." I know this is pretty rough to read, but the point was to bring everybody in line. You have to remember they had been in bondage for over 400 and some years, and I guess this was Yahweh's way of bringing people into line. But the point to reading this is to understand how important the Sabbath is to Yahweh, at least at this point. Numbers 28, "On the 7th day you will have a holy convocation. You will not do any regular work." A holy convocation means time to get together and fellowship and look at God's word or his scriptures. Deuteronomy 5:12. I'm going to back it up a little bit here. "And then Moses summoned all of Israel and said to them, 'Hear, Israel, the rules and regulations that I am speaking in your ears today, and you shall learn them, and you shall observe them diligently. Yahweh our God made a covenant with us at Horeb,'" that's Mount Sinai. "It was not with our ancestors that Yahweh made this covenant, but with these of us who are here today." So in other words, it wasn't just made with those people, it was made with you as well, because these people were there, because this is after all of the older generation had died. "Face to face, Yahweh spoke with you at the mountain from the midst of the fire. I was standing between you and Yahweh, and at the time to report to you the word of Yahweh. For you were afraid because of the presence of the fire, so that you did not go up to the mountain. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery." And then he goes into what we now call the 10 Commandments, what he would call, "These are my testimonies." And I want you to notice here's one, here's one, here's one, and here is the one on the Sabbath. And then here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. Observe the Sabbath day to make it holy, just as Yahweh your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall work, and you shall do all of your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath unto Yahweh your God. You shall not do any work, or your son, or your daughter, or your slave woman, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your domestic animals, or your resident alien who is in your towns, so that your slave and your slave woman may rest as you rest. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, Yahweh your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. So he's pretty specific. So at this point in time, if you were still wondering, was this given to just the Israelites by blood? I think this one kind of clears it up, that it's anyone who wants to be amongst the people of God. This is for them. Nehemiah 9:14. Then you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven and gave them right judgments, true teachings, good regulations, and commandments. You made known your holy Sabbath to them and gave them commandments, regulations, and laws by the hands of your servant Moses. You gave them bread from heaven for their starvation, and you caused water to go out from the rock from their thirst. You told them to go in order to take into possession the land that you have sworn by your hand to give to them. But they and our ancestors acted arrogantly and stiffened their necks and did not listen to your commandments. Now, the thing that's interesting here is they don't list all the regulations and the commandments given, but they do specifically list, you made known your holy Sabbath to them. Here we are in Nehemiah 10. We will not give our daughters. So at this point, Nehemiah is coming back and he's wanting to renew his covenant with God and bring the city back into the ways of God instead of the ways of man. And he says, and the people of the land who bring merchandise and any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not accept it from them on the Sabbath or on the holy day. We will forgo the crops of the seventh year and cancel every debt. So he's listing other things out here that they're going to do. But part of what they're going to do is they're just not going to let anybody sell anything inside of their gate. I think the purpose to that was, as God said, that anyone inside your gate shouldn't work. So if they came in and they're selling, they're working. This is Nehemiah 13, where he begins to make Sabbath reforms. And he talks about how they're going to shut their gates and they're not going to let people come in. And he says, in those days I saw in Judah people treading the winepress on the Sabbath, bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, along with wine, grapes, and figs, and every kind of burden, and bringing it all to Jerusalem on the day of the Sabbath. And I warned them at that time against selling food. Tyrene men who lived in Jerusalem brought fish and every kind of merchandise and sold it on the Sabbath to the descendants of Judah and Jerusalem. So I quarreled with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the day of the Sabbath? Did not your ancestors do this also? And our God brought on us all of these disasters on this city too. Now you are adding fierce wrath of Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So when it became dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors be shut and said that they should not be open until after the Sabbath. And so that's how he kept people from buying and selling inside the gates on the Sabbath. Now here's one, if you go back and you read this one, well, let's start here. He says, your new moon, let's see, where do we want to start? You must not continue to bring offerings of futility, incense. It is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the call of a convocation. I cannot endure iniquity with solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed festivals my soul hates. They have become to me like a burden. I am not able to bear them. This is talking about, at that time, there was a point in time where they literally put another idol up, or an altar up to worship another god in the temple. And so he's not talking about his appointed festivals and his new moons and his Sabbath. He's talking about those that the people chose to worship other gods on, or things that they chose to worship. I did also find it interesting to go back through some of these Isaiah ones, because like this one, if you're looking at even all over the world today, it says, "Your country is desolate, your cities are burned with fire. As for your land, aliens are devouring it in your presence, and it's desolate like devastation by foreigners." Go back and read this, Isaiah 1. It's very interesting in today's world. Thus says Yahweh, observe justice and do righteousness, for my salvation is close to coming, and my justice is being revealed. Happy is the man who does this, and the son of humankind who keeps hold of it, who keeps the Sabbath so as not to profane it, and who keeps his hand from doing any evil. Now here's another part that shows us it can be outside of Israel. And do not let the foreigner who joins himself to Yahweh say. So now this is someone who wants to be a follower of Yahweh. Surely Yahweh will separate me from his people meaning Israel. And do not let the eunuch say, look, I am a dry tree. For thus says Yahweh, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, that's the seventh day and the appointed times, and choose that in which I delight, and who keep a hold of my covenant, and I will give them a monument and a name in my house, and within my walls better than sons and daughters. I will give him an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. He's speaking about eunuchs. Look up eunuchs to understand what he's saying there. Foreigners who join themselves to Yahweh to serve him and to love the name of Yahweh, to become his servants. Now, a lot of people in the New Testament would consider the Gentiles to be foreigners. Everyone who keeps the Sabbath so as not to profane it, and those who keep hold of my covenant, I will bring them to my holy mountain. I will make them merry in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Declares the Lord Yahweh, who gathers the scattered ones of Israel. Still I will gather to him to his gathered ones. I think he's made it clear. If you want to keep his Sabbath and you want to be in covenant with him, you're one of his. You're a son and daughter. Isaiah 58. If you hold your foot back from the Sabbath, from doing your affairs on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a pleasure, the holy day of Yahweh honorable, if you honor him more than doing your ways, than finding your affairs in speaking a word, then you shall take your pleasure in Yahweh, and I will make you ride upon the heights of the earth, and I will feed you to the heritage of Jacob, your ancestor. Should we read that one again? Like, we take things out of the Old Testament and we make them ours because we like them. Why can't we take this out of the Old Testament and say, this is ours too? We like that. We're going to do this. Isaiah 66. And this shall happen, from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come down, bow and worship before me, says Yahweh. And they shall go out and look at the corpse of the people who have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. This is talking about after the rapture, after whatever it is you want to believe, the time after everything is completed here on earth, and heaven and earth have passed away, and we're now into the time when New Jerusalem is sitting here on earth, and we're in fellowship with God. This is eternity. This is talking about at that time. The people are going to be still celebrating the Sabbath. and the new moons, which new moons is, it's in relation to the festivals or God's appointed times. He has broken down his dwelling place like the garden. He has ruined his appointed feasts. Yahweh has made them forget in Zion festivals and Sabbath, and he has despised in his hangers king and priest. So at this point, he's like mad at the people, and they're forgetting the festivals and the Sabbath. Ezekiel 20. But I acted from the sake of my name to keep it from being profaned before the eyes of the nation among whom they lived, where I made known to them before their eyes to bring them out from the land of Egypt. And I brought them out from the land of Egypt, and I brought them to the desert. And I gave my statutes to them and my regulations. That's something important here, is that we like to say the commandments are the laws, but they are divided into separate different kinds, just like we have it today. Like we have ordinances and we have statutes and we have laws, and there's different penalties for each of those. God has the same things. I made known to them which, if a person does them, that he will live by them. Also my Sabbaths I gave to them to be a sign between me and between them, so they would know that I, Yahweh, am the one sanctifying them. So the purpose of the Sabbath and the appointed times is, again, a sign between God and you that he is your God. But in the desert, the house of Israel rebelled against me. They greatly profaned my Sabbaths. And I decided to pour out my rage on them in the desert and to destroy them. I, Yahweh, am your God, so go in my statutes and keep my regulations and do them, and treat my Sabbaths as holy. And they will be a sign between me and between you, that you may know that I, Yahweh, am your God. But the children rebelled. My Sabbaths were desecrated, and my Sabbaths they profaned. It's just amazing how much the Sabbath comes up and how important it seems to be to God. I mean, he doesn't even list anything else that they might have done except for profaning his Sabbaths. Ezekiel 22:8. Again, you despise my holy objects, my Sabbaths you profane. Slanderous men are among you to shed blood, and they among you eat upon the mountains. They do wickedness in the midst of you. They hide their eyes from my Sabbaths. Ezekiel 23:38. Also, they did this to me. They defiled my sanctuary on that day, and they profaned my Sabbaths. And when they slaughtered their children for their idols, they came to my sanctuary on that day to profane it. I mean, he's putting Sabbaths in with slaughtering children. Ezekiel 44. And at a legal dispute they themselves shall stand and judge, employing my judgments they shall judge it. And with respect to my laws and my statute, all my festivals they shall keep, and my Sabbaths they shall consecrate. Ezekiel 46:3. Thus says the Lord Yahweh, the gate of the inner courtyard facing east must be shut on the 6th of the days for work, but on the day of the Sabbath it must be open, and on the day of the new moon it must be opened. Hosea. And I will put an end to all her mirth, her festivals, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her appointed feasts. That's the thing to remember, is that we may not think about it this way today, but at that time, when there was other worship going on, their things were also called festivals, and their things were also called new moons, and they were also worshiping on their Sabbath days. And God keeps making a distinction between his Sabbath days and their Sabbath days. And now we're going to move into the New Testament. There's a lot of people that say that the Sabbath isn't in the New Testament, and that's why we no longer have to keep it. Again, remember, this is a ceasefire moment. Set aside your preconceived notions and just listen to the word, and then go away and meet with God and let him reveal to you what he wants to reveal to you. But this will show that the Sabbath is in the New Testament. And although there is not any place where Jesus says, keep the Sabbath day, but you'll see by his actions that he kept it. This is Matthew 12. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck off heads of grain and eat them. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, behold, your disciples are doing what is not permitted on the Sabbath. There was nothing that said you couldn't. In fact, if you look back through the laws, it says that, like, if you want to eat, you can pick something off to eat, but you can't go out and harvest. So in other words, whatever you can grab in your hand and eat, you were allowed to. So this was a man-made law. So he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those with him? And then he talks about how David and his people who were hungry came into the temple and ate stuff that they weren't really allowed to eat. And the point that he was saying is, but I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what it means, I want mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So he's basically saying that there are all these laws and these rules where, you can't work or you can't eat the showbread from the temple. But if someone's starving, they can have the showbread. If someone's starving, you can pick some grain and eat it. And he also points out, which this would have been hugely significant, like slapping these people in the face when he says, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. So he's basically saying there, look, I'm God and I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. And I'm going to tell you what it's about. And going on from there, he came into the synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, so this is is it permitted to heal on the Sabbath, in order that they could accuse him? But he said to them, what man will there be among you who will have one sheep, and if this one fell into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Then to what degree is a man worth more than a sheep? So then it is permitted to do good on the Sabbath. So that was the whole point, is if there are laws in the Old Testament that said if an animal was hurt or lost or in a hole, you could get it out. That's what he's saying. You would go and you would rescue a sheep to keep it safe, but you won't let me heal this man on the Sabbath? You're missing the whole point of the Sabbath. Okay, let's go down to Matthew 24. Jesus is given a speech and he says, but pray that your flight may not happen in winter or on the Sabbath. So from this particular one, we can foresee Jesus expecting there to still be a Sabbath day rest in the future. You can maybe go into a discussion on when this future is. Some believe it took place whenever the temple was destroyed. Some believe it's going to take place in the last days as part of tribulations and that. But either way, it shows that the Sabbath was still expected by Jesus further in the future. And he's actually talking about, so the coming of man will be. He's talking about when the coming of the man will be. So whatever it is that you believe in when Jesus is coming back, he's expecting people to still be keeping the Sabbath. Matthew 28. Now after the Sabbath, so here we go, is another Sabbath day. At the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to view the tomb. So this is after Jesus had died and he was in the tomb, and the women are coming to prepare his body. They didn't do it on the Sabbath because it was a Sabbath. So these are people who spent at least 3 years studying under Jesus, and at no point did they think after he had been crucified and died did they think that they could no longer observe the Sabbath. Here he is again, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. So here's Jesus on the Sabbath in a synagogue. The word synagogue, it's interesting when you look into it. Sometimes it's an assembly of people. It's the same meaning as ecclesiastic as church. So church and synagogue are the same word, but they wanted to divide out the Jews and the Gentiles in the New Testament so that when it was Jews, they would say synagogue. When it was Gentiles, they would say church. But later on, it gets a little murky because the Gentiles were going to synagogue. There wasn't ever a church in the New Testament. They met in the synagogues, and we'll see that later. Mark, this is when he's talking about the plucking of the grain, which we already talked about, and the withered hand guy. So those don't count as separate times, but we have 3 times now that we've seen Jesus in the synagogues. And he entered a synagogue again, and the man, oh, no, that was where we were at, sorry. Mark 6. And he went from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. So that's time number 4 that Jesus was in the synagogue. And when it was already evening, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath. So since the Sabbath is on the 7th day, this would be the 6th day. This is when Joseph goes to ask for his body and then takes it and puts it into the tomb. And he wanted to get it done before the Sabbath day took effect. Mark 16, and when the Sabbath day was over, Mary Magdalene. So this is them. We already looked at this story, but in this account by Mark, he says very early in the morning on the first day of the week. So this would have been for them, the first day of the week would have started at sundown on what we call Saturday night. So that would have been early in the morning, sometime after sundown on Saturday night. Luke 4:16, and he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and according to his customs he entered into the synagogue on the day of the Sabbath. And that's when he read the scrolls. And I believe this is the same as the one that was recorded in Matthew. So we won't, in Mark, so we won't count that one as a as a 5th time. And he came to Capernaum and was teaching. And in the synagogue, there was a man with a spirit of an unknown demon. So this has to be a different time because we haven't read about the spirit in an unclean demon. But he was in the synagogue, and again, he has a confrontation with the Pharisees there. And basically, it's, when you're helping someone, you're helping someone. It doesn't matter if it's the Sabbath. This is Luke telling his version of the grains in the field. This is the woman with the unclean spirit. All those who opposed him it's funny here because all those who opposed him were humiliated, and the whole crowd was rejoicing at the splendid things that were being done by him. So here he is. He's like, you know what, you're hypocrites. You'll take care of donkeys and stuff on the Sabbath and give them water, but I can't heal a woman. So again, he's being confrontational. This one is, he came to the house of a certain. Now this time, he's in the leader of a Pharisees on the Sabbath. I can just imagine this picture because he's sitting in a Pharisee's house eating a meal. And behold, a certain man was in front of him, suffering from edema. And Jesus answered and said to the legal experts and the Pharisees. So this is where it's funny, because just picture it. He's sitting there, and he looks at everybody and goes, is it permitted to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. They all looked at him, because there was no law that said you can't heal on the Sabbath. But they remained silent, and he took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, who among you, if your son or your ox falls into a well on the day of the Sabbath, will not immediately pull him out? And they were not able to make a reply to these things. He's calling them out. And it was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was drawing near, and the women had been accompanying him from Galilee, followed and saw the tomb and how his body was placed. And they returned and prepared fragrant spices and perfumes. On the Sabbath day they rested according to the commandment. Like, Luke is making it a point that these women, even though Jesus Christ has died and hasn't resurrected yet, are still keeping the Sabbath. This is John recording when Jesus told the guy to pick up his mat, and the Jews at that time had a big problem and said it's not permitted for you to pick up the mat. But he answered him, the one who made me well, the guy said, the one who made me well told me to pick up my mat. And this guy's probably thinking, this guy healed me? I think I'm going to listen to him. But apparently, Jesus didn't have a problem with the guy picking up his mat and carrying it, because there was no law against it. That was a man-made law. You have the crowd replied, you have a demon who is seeking to kill you. Jesus answered and said to them, I perform one work, and you are all astonished. Because of this, Moses has given you a circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. So they're saying, these are people who are like, okay with circumcising someone on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so the law of Moses will not be broken, because it had to be done at a certain time. Are you angry with me because I made a whole man well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to outward appearance, but judge according to righteous judgment. So again, they're making up their own rules, and Jesus is confronting them about the rules that they made on the Sabbath day, because it doesn't say that anywhere in the Old Testament. There were never laws against the stuff that they're talking about. They brought him, the one formerly blind, to the Pharisees. Now the day of which Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes was the Sabbath. Because he doesn't... So the Pharisees were also asking him again how he received his sight. And he said, he put clay on my eyes and I washed and I see. So some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God, because he does not observe the Sabbath. Others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. The Sabbath day is really what got Jesus in a lot of trouble, because there were a lot of man-made rules about the Sabbath day, and he came to break all those man-made rules down. This is about the preparation day again. Here we are in Acts. At this time, Paul stood up. So this is Paul, and he is in a synagogue on the day of Sabbath. So Paul observed the Sabbath in synagogues. Here's Acts 13. That's what we were just... Oh, no, this is further down. Prophets that read on... Yeah, that's down here. Okay. And as they were going out, they began urging that these things be spoken about to them on the next Sabbath. So they're already assuming that Paul's going to be there next week. And after the synagogue had broke up, many of the Jews and the devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who were speaking to them and were persuading them to continue in the grace of God. And on the coming Sabbath, nearly the whole city came together to hear the word of God. So again, there were Jews and other people in the synagogue, and they're saying, please come back. And then Paul comes back, and almost the entire city is there. They're not all Jews. Okay, we have Acts 15, and we're coming to the end. Then it seems best to the apostles and the elders, together with the whole church, to send men chosen from among them in Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. So there was this discussion about... let's go back up here. There was this long discussion about whether the Gentiles should be circumcised or not. And the thing is with this is that at that time, because you have a mixture of the Jews and the Gentile, the Jews are trying to say, but this is what you have to do. You have to get circumcised. You won't be saved if you're not circumcised. That would be our words today. If you don't get circumcised, if you don't get baptized, you're not saved. And so they're coming in disagreement about that. And Paul and Barnabas are like, no, that's not what saves you. It's the belief in Jesus Christ that saves you. So they have this long discussion. You can see Peter stood up and said some things. So at the end, James kind of comes along to summarize everything that they're saying. And they're saying, men and brothers, listen to me. Simon, which is Peter, has described how God first concerning himself to take from among the Gentiles a people for his name. So in other words, Peter was told to bring people who were that were outside the Jewish faith. And again, that's another thing. The Jews, it's a Jewish faith. All the Jews are Israelites. But the Jews is a faith. Like if we said the Catholics or the Protestants or whatever, it's a faith makeup. So now Peter is going out to the people who are Gentiles. Gentiles basically not a Jew. You're either a Jew or a Gentile. And how the Gentiles had received all of the same gifts and spirits and all of that had happened. And so James is like, okay, so Peter is saying that the Spirit's moving on these Gentiles. Who are we to make a distinction? And then he goes on to read what the prophets had said. And therefore I conclude we should not cause difficulty for those from among the Gentiles who turn to God, but we should write a letter to them to abstain from the pollution of idols, sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled from blood. Now here's the thing about those three things. By taking those three things and telling new converts that they can't do those things, pretty much would keep them out of every single other temple, because all the other temples had at least one, if not all three, of these as part of their worship service. For Moses has those who proclaim him in every city from ancient generations, because he is read aloud in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So they're expecting that all of these things that is in the Torah is being taught on the Sabbath in the synagogues to the Gentiles. The other thing that I think that we forget when we're looking at these scriptures and we're reading the New Testament, the very first New Testament book wasn't written or published until 30 some years after Christ's resurrection. These people weren't sitting in synagogue reading the New Testament. They were sitting in synagogue reading the Old Testament, specifically the Torah, which was the capital T Torah, which was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. They weren't sitting in there reading the New Testament. And they didn't have, at one point Jesus sent out 72. So it wasn't like there was someone in every single synagogue that had traveled with Jesus. And the other thing is that Paul taught for a good 6 years before he ever met with any of the disciples. So we're pretty far out there, and so they're in the synagogues learning the Torah, trying to struggle with, well, what do I do first? How do I do this as a Gentile? And the Jews are like, well, you can't because you're not a Jew. And it was a confusing time. So they wrote this letter to the Gentiles, and they said, to the brothers who are from among the Gentiles in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia. This is who they're writing to. So they're writing to the Gentiles who are in the synagogues every Sabbath. Because we have heard from some among you that there's disorder, and he goes on to tell them, abstain from food sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you can keep yourselves from these things, you will do well. And let's just start off there. Let's just start with that, and then we'll move forward. As you learn all the other things, you can start applying them, because that's the whole point to the grace. The grace of God is that you have the blood of Jesus to apply to anything that you're not aware of an unintentional sin, you're covered. Once you learn about it, you start trying to do it, and we're all good. Let's come back down here, go down to Acts 16. And on the Sabbath day, we went outside the city gates beside the river. So again, there's still a Sabbath day happening. Acts 17, this is Paul. Now, after they traveled through these towns, they were in the synagogues of the Jews. And as was his custom, Paul went to them, and on 3 Sabbath days he discussed with them from the scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that it was necessary for Christ. Now, the key to this one is he's in the synagogue on a Sabbath day, and he's using the scriptures, which is all of our Old Testament, no New Testament, only Old Testament, and is explaining and demonstrating that it was necessary for Christ to suffer and die for the dead, and saying, "This Jesus who I am proclaiming to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, and also a large number of God-fearing Greeks, and not a few of the prominent women. So again, he used the Old Testament to explain Jesus, which is kind of interesting because whenever Jesus came back and he was walking along with the people on their way to leaves my mind now, Emmaus, I think, he's using all of the Old Testament scriptures to describe himself and tell about himself, and he's given them the story. It's funny because there was no New Testament, and we're just so used to having it that, and it's not a bad thing to use it. It's just to keep in mind that these people didn't have the New Testament. It's a luxury that we have. So again, here's Paul, and he argued in the synagogues every Sabbath, attempting to persuade both Jews and Greeks. Both Jews and Greeks in the synagogues every Sabbath. Colossians. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you. Now, this one is a huge one that's really misunderstood. With reference to eating or drinking or participating in a feast or a new moon or a Sabbath. Now, let's put this in context. There are Gentiles who are now converting and following Christ, leaving their old way. And we already read several times where God has come against the festivals and the Sabbaths and the feasts of other gods. And so their friends and families are like, "Oh, but you're not going to this temple and you're not sacrificing to this god. And oh, Zeus is going to be mad at you and Odin's going to have a problem." And he's trying to say, like, listen, you're leaving that way. Don't let them judge you because you're leaving those things. And then he says, which are a shadow of what is to come, but the reality is Christ. It's all about Christ. Let no one condemn you, taking pleasure in humility and the worship of angels, going into detail about the things which we have seen, inflated without cause by their fleshly minds. There's no way that this is talking about God things if he's saying that those are out of fleshly minds. And not holding fast to the head, for whom the whole body, supported and held together by the ligaments and sinews, grows with the growth of God. If you have died with Christ to the elemental spirits of the world, so there's all of these things going on in all these temples, but you've died with Christ to all of those elemental spirits. Why do you submit to them as if living in the world? So you've died to all of those old ways, all those old Sabbaths, all those old festivals, all those things that you used to eat and drink. You died to all of that. So why are you trying to live in the world as if you haven't? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which things are all meant for destruction by consuming according to human commandments and teachings. This is about the human commandments and the human teachings about what not to touch, what not to taste. The other thing that we have to remember is, so you have these Jews and Gentiles. The Jews were also leaving their way of doing things. That's what the contention was with Jesus in coming against a lot of the Jewish leaders. So you have Jews leaving their Jewish ways and Gentiles leaving their pagan ways, coming together and trying to figure out, how do we make all this work? What do we do now? And this is what Paul is telling them, like, look, don't. You're not living in that way. So if you have a Sadducee or a Pharisee that comes up to you and says, hey, you can't carry your mat on a Sabbath day, he Jesus already said you could. You've died to that through Jesus Christ. So you have two things going on here, and there's a tension there. Which things already they have, to be sure, an appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and humanity and unsparing treatment of the body, do not have any value against the indulgence of flesh. This isn't saying that if you don't want to observe the Sabbath like God commanded, don't let people judge you of that. He's saying, if you don't want to observe the Sabbath in the way that the Pharisees and the Sadducees have told you in their man-made human traditions, don't. And don't let them judge you on that. If you don't want to observe this Sabbath to this God, and the people are trying to tell you, oh, you have to, don't. And don't let them judge you on that, because you died to all of those Gentile ways and all of those Jewish ways in Christ. And He's the important thing, and He's the one that you want to follow. It's all about Christ. He even goes on to say, therefore, if you've been raised up through Christ, seeking the things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God, set your mind on the things above and not on the things on earth. Get into your scriptures and see what God is telling you to do, because those are the things above. Hebrews 4. Now this one, before we get into this one, the thing to understand about Hebrews is it's pretty much an entire book about the feast day of the Day of Atonement, and it's taking the old covenant Day of Atonement, the way it was done then in the tabernacle with sacrifices, and it's explaining how we now have the Day of Atonement through Jesus Christ. And if we don't understand the tabernacle and we don't understand the old ways, then we can't really make that connection here in Hebrews. But aside from that, now that we've just done this entire perusal through the Bible from Genesis all the way to here, and we get to this section in Hebrews about the rest and the Sabbath day, I think you might see a little bit of a different picture of what you thought it might have meant when you read it before going through the entire Bible with nothing but the Sabbath day and the seventh day rest. So we're going to start back up a little bit of a ways, and we're going to start up here. Let's see, we'll start here. You can, let's start back. He says the same thing twice, pretty much, because here he references the same thing that he does here. So I'm not going to start up here, but you should read up there. I'm going to start right here. For who, when they heard it, were disobedient. And he's talking about the Israelites. Remember, the Israelites includes anyone in the Israel camp. Surely it was not all who went out from Egypt through Moses. And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose dead bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear they would not enter into his rest, except those who were disobedient? So he was saying that those who were disobedient would not enter into his rest. Now, when I say that, and we think back through all of the scriptures that we just looked at, that should have some type of a different meaning to you. We have to remember that when these things are written, the people in that day, they memorize things. And the teachers of that day, when they would say 5 or 6 words from something in the past in the Bible, in what we call our Old Testament, they intended for everyone to recall everything around that, not just those 5 words, but really just to go back and recall sometimes the entire scroll. We would call that the entire book. So when he's saying that, he's telling people, okay, now think back. Think back. Now you think back, because we've just been through the entire Genesis all the way up to Hebrews. Who were the disobedient? Who did he continuously say were disobedient and wouldn't enter into into his rest? And see who we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. Therefore, when you see therefore, it means before you read on, figure out what therefore is. Therefore, because they were not able to enter into his because of unbelief, let us fear while there remains a promise to enter into his rest, that none of you appear to fall short of it. So don't do what they did. Don't fall short of entering into his rest because of your unbelief. And if you want to look at us and who is us, who is Hebrews written to? Hebrews is believed. There's nowhere that it says, hey, this is to you and this is from me. We don't know who the author is, but it is written to what they believe were like Jewish Christians who were enduring persecution and were tempted to revert back to their former Jewish faith. And so it's Jewish Christians, so this would apply to Christians, period. So what we're about to read is for Christians. You don't have to be a Jewish Christian. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as those also did. Did you catch that? The good news to those, and those were the people of Israel coming out of Egypt, were proclaimed the good news. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as those also did, but the good news they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united with those who heard it in faith. Like, that should be mind-blowing a bit. The gospel, good news, gospel. Sometimes the Bible that you're reading might say the gospel was proclaimed to the people in Israel, but they heard it and they didn't benefit from it because they weren't united with those who did hear it in faith. For we who have believed enter into rest, just as he has said, as I swore in my anger, they will never enter into my rest. Well, let's go take a look at this. This is in Psalm 95. So let's go back and look at Psalm 95. And let's just read it. Come, let us sing for joy to Yahweh. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. With songs, let us shout joyfully to him. I'm sure someone has sang a song that had those words in it. It's in a lot of the older hymns. For Yahweh is the great God and the great King over all gods, in whose hands are the unexplored places of the earth, and the heights of the mountains are his. To whom belong the seas that he made, and the dry land that his hands formed. Now, the people in listening to Psalms 95 probably would have started picturing Genesis 1, and what was happening in Genesis 1, and how God created the heavens and the earths and divided the sea from the dry lands. Come in, let us worship and bow down, let us kneel before Yahweh our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your heart as at Meribah, as in the days of Massa in the wilderness, when your ancestors, the Israelites, and all those who traveled with them, tried me. They put me to the test, even though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people worse hearts wonder. They are a people whose hearts wondered. And my ways they do not know. Therefore I swear in my anger, they shall surely never enter into my rest. Now, when you read this, in my ways they do not know, think about how many times we read that, you're not observing my Sabbath. When are you going to start listening to my commands? It's a little crazy when you connect it all together. So let's go back to Hebrew, where we were. So they will never enter my rest. And yet these works have been accomplished from the foundation of the world, again referring back to Genesis. For he has spoken somewhere about the seventh day in this way. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And in this passage again, they will never enter into my rest. Since therefore, since they will never enter my rest, it remains for some to enter into it. And the ones to whom the good news was proclaimed, back in Israel, previously, did not enter because of disobedience. Again, he ordained a certain day. Now, some people will say that that is today because it says ordains a certain day today, speaking by David after so long ago, just as he had been said before. So he ordained a certain day just as he had been said before. This is kind of talking, this is a backtrack. We do this all the time. We start to tell a story and then we backtrack. He ordained a certain day today, speaking by David. We read it in this scripture, just as it had been said before. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. For if Joshua had caused them to rest, he would not have spoken about another day after these things. So he wouldn't have said there'll be another day to enter the rest. Consequently, so because Joshua said there was another day, consequently, a Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. For the one who has entered into his rest has also himself rested from his works, just as God did from his own works. Therefore, let us make every effort to enter into that rest, in order that no one may fall in the same pattern of disobedience. For the word of God is living and active and sharper than any double-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of soul and spirit, both joint and marrow, and able to judge the reflections and thoughts of his heart. And no creature is hidden in the sight of him, but all things are naked and laid bare to the eyes of him to whom we may give our account. So this is about the Day of Atonement. And on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would bring a sacrifice on behalf of the entire community, and it would be sacrificed. And that is what Jesus did. Jesus became the high priest. You'll go on down, he'll talk about a high priest like Melchizedek, and he offered the sacrifice for the whole community. So there's a double meaning here. These people no longer have to do that because we have our final sacrifice. It's already been made, so you no longer have to do those particular parts of what you were told to do in Egypt, out when you were coming out of Egypt, because Christ has already came and fulfilled that. He has fulfilled the high priest part, and he has fulfilled the sacrifice part. And so now you need to enter into the rest of not offering these sacrifices. But he is also referring to the fact that and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. They will never enter into my rest. And he continuously talked about the Sabbath day and not entering into that rest that he was trying to give people, because it was a Sabbath day unto the Lord, unto Yahweh, unto God. And if you can continue on down, you'll see more of a picture if you go back and understand the tabernacle and the sacrifices and the priest's job, and that's what Jesus came here to fulfill, was what the priest did and what the sacrifice did. And you can read Hebrews from a whole different perspective. But today we've completed an entire study on the Sabbath day and the seventh day rest that has been from Genesis all the way to Hebrews. And there's some others alluded to in Revelation if you want to continue your studies. I didn't include it here because it doesn't specifically say seventh day rest, nor does it say Sabbath day specifically. But if you go forward, and there's some allusion back to the seventh day rest that God took. Okay, well, thank you for joining us on a Ceasefire Moment, and I hope you've learned something.